think about the bladder and the vagina, we know that certain lactobacillus can be inflammatory, and most of them, though, are going to be protective.
This is part 2 of our interview with Beverley Sarstedt, a nutritional therapist based in the UK who works with many recurrent and chronic UTI patients. And you can learn more about Beverley's background in part 1. Thanks again for taking the time to answer our questions.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions around pH. So a lot of people have asked whether there is a pH for the urine and the body that is considered most beneficial.
Yeah, the urinary pH is quite a narrow window between 6.4 and 6.7. And that's why there's an emphasis around urinary pH. One thing that's really interesting is that, most of the, up to about 90% of the bacterial infections are E. coli. And interestingly, they favor a more acidic environment. And I find that fascinating as a nutritional therapist, because our diet now, the Western diet, as I mentioned in the first part, is very much acidic. It's very, very full of processed, inflammatory, high sugar foods. So in some ways, we're creating the most beautiful, perfect environment if we can for an E. coli infection from an acid point of view. So I think that's partly why the emphasis has been on being more alkalizing, but definitely the alkalizing part is nothing more complex than eating cleaner foods, eating lots of vegetables, and most vegetables are alkalizing. So as long as we're incorporating vegetables across the day, snacking on vegetables as well, instead of having tea and biscuits, you could be snacking on some carrots and hummus or whatever, but it's thinking outside the box and trying to incorporate vegetables across the day, increasing the variety, increasing the number of vegetables in your salad. Instead of having one leafy green in your salad, maybe have 2 or 3 leafy greens in your salad, but all the time trying to add more and increase the diversity, because then if we do that, then by default, we're going to be more alkalizing. And that's really the direction that we ideally want to go in. So that is useful, and it is certainly possible with diet, because, basically every time we eat, we make a choice, whether we eat more acidic foods or whether we eat more slightly alkalizing foods. So getting that balance right is really helpful.
Do you think it's beneficial for people to test their urine using test strips to monitor the pH until they can get it right?
I think it is useful, and I think it would be really motivating to people as well, because I think if you know what's going on, then you're more likely to do something about it. And also it can be confusing with foods as well. And everyone's going to be slightly different. It's back to that individual difference aspect. So I think that it would be useful, not to do it, over the top, but I think because you don't want to stress over these things. Whenever you mention testing, people get so stressed, and stress is already a problem in this community. So I think that, if you can have a go and just, as a nice, interesting exercise to do, and then see whether you have a particular food that day, then see if your pH changes.
Okay. Talking of impacting things directly in the bladder, we know there's an association between the gut microbiome, vaginal microbiome, and then the bladder microbiome. Is it possible to directly impact the bladder microbiome with diet, or is it more of an indirect path?
No, directly you can influence that, because this is how our microbiome comes about, because of what we eat. I mean, I'm sure that in a tribal community, they won't be having the problems that we have with microbiome, because they're not exposed to the supermarkets and the processed foods and all the things that damage those things. So yes, absolutely. And as I said in part 1, then we need to be, the key thing is introducing various types of fiber from all sources. So lots and lots from vegetables, big emphasis on vegetables, some fruits, and then your variety of pulses and nuts and seeds, and whole grains. And these are the things that we need to be using to support the microbiome. In addition to which, there are nutrients that support the microbiome, key ones being vitamin D and omega-3, which are also important for gut health. Hydration is important for gut health. So there are lots of things, but definitely we absolutely, by our diet and lifestyle choices, we hugely influence it. It's essential. It's a, you know, if anyone thinks that they can get away with just, you know, taking an antibiotic now and again to clear an infection, somehow they're going to recover from this, that's not going to happen. We have to, all of us, work on our gut status, because our immune system is 70 to 80% in our gut. So if we want to reduce inflammation, if we want to support our immune system optimally, then we simply have no choice but to do these things and to make the diet work for us, not against us.
In terms of reestablishing a healthy microbiome, are there particular foods you recommend that are probiotic or prebiotic?
Yeah. Now, when it comes to what we mean by those terms, then the prebiotics are the foods that feed the probiotics, the good bacteria. So when we're thinking of prebiotics, then common ones that are talked about would be things like onions, garlic, leeks, artichokes, bananas, apples. All of these things are good prebiotics. And it's important to mention those because, again, if we think that, oh, I'll just buy a probiotic tablet, I don't need to worry about changing my diet or whatever, I'll just live on crisps and cake and take a probiotic. We can't do that because the good bacteria have to be fed, they have to be nourished, we have to provide the right environment. Just as we do when we're planting seeds in the garden, you know, we want to, before we plant the seeds, we want to take the weeds out, we want to take the stones out and the mess, and we want to then nourish that soil and feed it. And so, you know, our dietary choices are absolutely important, and we need to create the right nourishment in order to feed that good bacteria. Otherwise, we've kind of wasted our money. We need to get that right. So prebiotics are really important. Now, when it comes to probiotics, then we certainly do use them in supplement form. All of the ones that we use are research-based. They have to survive and thrive gut acidity. And when you're selecting a probiotic, this is really important to mention that, you know, we have to know what strain it is, because if we know that and it's not documented and it's not clinically trialed and we don't know about it, then we don't know what we're taking. So if you buy something online, you have to know what you're looking for. And interestingly, I did a stool sample with a lady just last week who had, she thought, been taking a probiotic, and in her stool sample there was no lactobacillus or bifidobacteria. And these are very important. They're anti-inflammatory, we need them to be there, they support the immune system and multiple other things, but she didn't have any. Now, she had been taking a probiotic, she told me which one, I looked it up, and again there was no species mentioned. So we need all that evidence base for everything that we do. So that's just an important point about probiotics. Then there are foods that are fermented foods, so the likes of sauerkraut and kefir and so on, kombucha. There are lots of things that we can take, but again, I'm going to mention a little caveat with those, because you know, if you are using sauerkraut and you've never used it before, take it very slowly. You know, we want to be using these foods as a condiment. You know, it's not the same as having a plate full of a big portion of cabbage with using a little teaspoon, because that can irritate. And if you're someone who has SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, you may find these foods would not be the right thing for you at that time, because they would aggravate symptoms and worsen your bloating and your pain and discomfort. So it's, you know, this, as I said earlier, where food gets a bit messy, and we have to know the scenario that we're dealing with, because for some people, absolutely, you can go straight into fermented foods. For other people, you have to be super careful. But otherwise, yes, I mean, in principle, absolutely, then these foods are great. Equally, you know, what people sometimes do is they go mad over a kefir, and they suddenly bought all this dairy-based kefir, and they find their symptoms get worse. And that might be not so much because of the probiotic, but because of the actual dairy component, and that they don't know that they're maybe before they didn't really have much dairy, and now all of a sudden having tons of it because they think, oh, I'll take kefir, it's good for me. So again, that's a common thing that we see, where people take kefir and their symptoms get worse. But that's maybe because of the dairy, but it may be because they have SIBO and it's the bacterial component. So there's lots of things that we need to think about. But otherwise, yes, absolutely. If you don't have those as a problem, then absolutely fermented foods, absolutely great for supporting your microbiome.
Is it always a bad thing if probiotics cause bloating or symptoms, or could it be an indication that it's shifting the microbiome in a positive direction?
If it's a short-term thing, it can be a shifting. There can be temporary shifts, absolutely. But if it's persisting, then no.
Okay.
But the other thing is that it's quite clear, we get lots of clues from the history. If somebody has SIBO, bloating is a major symptom, the most significant. I mean, with SIBO, you can have symptoms of constipation, diarrhea, abdominal pain, but bloating is a particularly strong one. And obviously, if you are bloating, that's not a normal thing that you'd want to happen chronically or to persist. You want to, it's a sign that something's just not right. So yeah, small changes are fine, but not if anything persists. We definitely want to get on top of that.
Okay. Do you work with a lot of patients who are on long-term antibiotic protocols? I know there are a lot of people in this community that have been taking antibiotics long-term, and we often hear from people that are looking for support, such as what you offer. Can you maybe provide some insights into what you've seen and how you would approach that?
Yeah, certainly. With antibiotics, again, because obviously they're taking them long-term for these bacterial infections potentially. But what happens is, and this is why Ruth started her research, is that long-term protocols with antibiotics basically don't tackle the root cause in terms of the bacteria. They may not even be attacking the right bacteria. And when you have something long-term, for whatever reason, we're going to create ultimately resistance. And then the other problem with that, again, this goes back to Ruth's research, is the fact that these bacteria are very clever, and they want to survive. So they create these biofilm structures so that they can resist these antibacterials, whether that's antibiotic or botanicals or whatever. So, long-term solutions are not the answer. But when people have been on that already, then they're going to have issues with compromised gut health. And so very, very commonly, those ladies would come to us, and men, but it's mostly ladies, with issues with chronic yeast infection, with issues with IBS, reflux, bloating, SIBO, many, many different scenarios. And we basically, that's what we're trained in. We work with all of those and try and get people's microbiome reestablished, but also teaching them about gut health, teaching them how to optimize their gut health, which foods to go for, talking about prebiotics and probiotics, fiber, all of these things, and also testing these things as well. So we do stool testing, we do SIBO testing, we do many different tests, but you can get to the root of what's going on with their gut health and what the level of damage is by stool testing, because within a stool test, you're looking to see what the commensal bacteria that we all have are doing. So, how well we're doing in that form. You're looking for signs of undergrowth or overgrowth. You're looking for any signs of pathogenic bacteria or yeast or parasites, Helicobacter pylori. You're looking for lots of areas of compromise. You're also looking for immunology and inflammatory markers. So it's a really good MOT to see what's going on with our gut health, and then we can support that at an individual level much more strategically if we've got all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So that's something that we do, very, very commonly as regards testing. And then we can support them at, not just reestablishing the microbiome, but when it comes to leaky gut, that intestinal permeability, which is going to be there in those scenarios, then we want to be sealing and healing those epithelial cells. We want to be sealing those together. And there are supplements that we use to do that. So we work through those as well. And that's a big topic in its own right, which is probably a topic for another time, because some of those actually have an effect on biofilms. So we have to be choosy about the ones that we use. So yeah, but ultimately we're trying to reinstate the intestinal permeability to improve absorption, improve immunity, and to solve the problem of those foods getting through into the blood system that normally wouldn't. So reestablishing gut integrity is a big part of it. And also, in those cases, dealing with the fallout from that, because if they have ended up with nutrient deficiencies and all these other things, then that needs to be assessed as well. But yeah, it makes up a huge part of our work, actually, it is dealing with that.
Do you think it's possible to reestablish gut integrity while still being on the long-term antibiotic protocol?
I think that it's like with all these things, it's possible to offset. If you are, it's a difference between someone who is on long-term antibiotics and lives on crisps and Coke and sweets, and somebody who therefore is promoting that inflammatory state and promoting the bad bacteria in the gut and the urinary tract, versus somebody who is doing all the right things that they can to support the microbiome. And also, it's back to what I said about food sensitivities causing that problem with inflammation, with upregulating the immune system, and the fact that you will get that visceral hypersensitivity in the bladder, in those tissues, and the whole of that pelvic region, actually. And food intolerances can drive that. So we absolutely need to know if we are intolerant to things, what they are, and to act on that, because if we keep eating those foods, then they're just going to drive the inflammation, and we're really pedaling backwards then. And it's a shame, because if you're doing some things right and then other things not so right, then it's a bit like you're going up the ladder and then you're going down the snake again. So we really need to get the whole scenario as optimal as we can. So absolutely, it will make a huge difference, and that's why some people's recoveries are a little bit better than others, because they're doing all these things. And also, if you want to get out of the trap of constant infections, then we want to be reducing inflammation and trying to reestablish the microbiome. Because again, if you think about the bladder and the vagina, we know that certain lactobacillus can be inflammatory, and most of them, though, are going to be protective. They're going to inhibit the growth of certain pathogens. So we're trying as much as we can get the balance right, and it is a bit of a seesaw between the two. Then we can inhibit some of those pro-inflammatory pathways and inhibit the growth of some of those troublemaker bacteria that we don't want on board. And diet has a huge role in that, in fixing the gut.
Okay, and you briefly touched on biofilms and disrupting biofilms. Are there foods or supplements that you recommend for this purpose?
One of the common ones that we used for breaking down biofilms is curcumin biofilm defense. It's something that we use all of the time in all of our new patients. What Ruth has done is a lot of research into genetic differences in people's abilities to break down biofilms. And when you can do the full range of tests, there are other pathways you can go down in terms of individual supplements. But at the moment in the UK, that's a work in progress, because we haven't found quite all of the right tests that we want to, that they have with ease in the States. So that's something to kind of watch this space, because we're working on that one in the background. Other things like N-acetylcysteine, NAC, is a common one, which a lot of ladies might be taking that for respiratory issues. It breaks down mucus. They might be taking it for liver detoxification, and they may have found along the way that when they take those things, that quite by accident they think, oh, I've actually had an increase while I was taking that for another reason. But it's actually because NAC, it just happens to be one of those common ones that does have that potential to break down biofilms. So that can be one as well. But those are the more common ones. And then, as I say, watch the space for further news on biofilms, and that'll be a topic for another time.
Yeah, we will definitely. The last questions on supplements were around DMannose. So it says in research that it's not properly digested by the body, therefore doesn't affect blood sugar levels. Do you think as a sugar, though, it might feed pathogenic organisms?
Generally, it doesn't, because it is a low glycemic index. So usually it's not causing a problem. It is metabolized through the gut. And so I suppose there's that potential of somebody, with chronic dysbiosis in the gut, might not be metabolizing it as well as they should be. But in theory, it shouldn't be a problem because it's a low glycemic index sugar. So it should be okay. The one thing about that, I mean, long before I started working with the patient population that is now coming through Ruth and through all of this work, you know, when we were dealing with the kind of the 80 to 90% that would have been the E. coli infections, then DMannose is very relevant to that population because it attaches to E. coli. But if your bacteria isn't E. coli, then DMannose is not relevant anyway. And I think that's where people can get a bit confused and maybe read about a supplement like DMannose online and think, oh my goodness, this is the panacea, the cure-all, and then they take it and it doesn't do a blind thing for them. But that's because they haven't got E. coli. So if you haven't got E. coli, then it's not relevant anyway. But that's worth mentioning just in case anyone thought, oh yes, I'll go and get that. But if you have got E. coli, then it is an excellent supplement, and I have long used it. It's very, very good, and we've not had any problems blood sugar wise with it.
Okay, that's really good to know. This has all been so interesting. I wanted to give you a chance to tell us a bit more about how you work with patients when you first see someone. What's the approach that you take?
Okay, so even before we meet them, they will fill in a huge functional medicine questionnaire. So that will go right from birth. It goes through all of their body systems, the whole of their medical history as much as they can remember. It asks for dates on some of the things, and that's because when we receive the questionnaire at our end, it comes preloaded on a software tool, and we can actually see with the dates their timeline. So we can see that they had their tonsils out when they were 10, or they had their appendix out when they were 23, or whatever it might be. But we can see all of those things that led into potentially developing these UTI symptoms or any other aspect of their medical history. And then we start to join the dots. And as part of that first session, we take them through that timeline. We talk about the timeline for quite a long time, and talking about triggers, drivers. These are all functional medicine terms, but it's looking at those things which can be triggering the condition that you now have, or could be driving it. So those are things that we're doing all the time, whether that's food, lifestyle choices. So we talk about those things, and that's very empowering, because then, it's about trying to help people to understand their health and to therefore get into the driving seat of their own health, where they can have some control, and they also see the relevance of the choices that we all make. One really important thing I always tell people is that when it comes to functional medicine, we always say that with genes, they might load the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger for that gun. And the environment is basically everything that happens to us from the moment we're conceived, and even before we're conceived, actually, because it's that environment that we're being planted into, like the seed in your garden, that affect our immune health right from the day that we come into this world. And that's why, we ask so many questions, and we're looking at, we will know your drug medicines history. Right at the end of the questionnaire, it asks how many antibiotics have you had, how many steroids, how many anti-inflammatory drugs have you been on the pill. And that's because all of these, not just antibiotics, but anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen, naproxen, etc., steroids, and also the oral contraceptive pill, they all affect your microbiome, your gut health. So these are all common ones that we look for and assess. So we know, before we meet a client, we know more about them than their GP ever will, because we've actually read a questionnaire that will take them a good couple of hours to complete, because it's going through the whole medical history. And unless you kick over every stone and you really understand that person's history, their genetics, but also their biochemistry, then you can't really properly go forward and help them in a more targeted way to optimize their health across the board. So that's a big part of what we do. And then that first session, we allocate, normally most clients we allocate an hour and a half. That would be a standard. For the UTI community, we allocate up to 2 hours for that first session. And the reason we do that is because we found with experience it often takes that long. We also find that by the time, because these things have been very chronic, and people have felt let down. They felt so they've gone around all sorts of corners and still seem to be pedaling backwards. And the pain as well associated with this is just horrific. So the mental health side is huge, and that's something we, as a team, there are 3 of us that work in my team. The mental health side we take very, very seriously, because it can be for some individuals particularly serious. And we, we have a member of our team as well who's a psychotherapist we refer on to for trauma and other aspects. But there's it's a huge effort that we all put in, and we do allocate that extra time, because sometimes people might just need 20 minutes to half an hour of that session just to let it all out. And to let those emotions come through, because it's really like a pressure cooker sometimes waiting to just pop by the time they get that appointment. And the fact that somebody listens and understands and is given time to them and listen to their story and trust their story and believe their story, that's a huge thing. And the other thing I would add to that is that very often, especially if the types of people that we would see, maybe they've had multiple tests, they've been told, oh no, you don't have any bacteria there, and they're convinced that they do. And then they feel as though they're being treated as a mental health case, and therefore the reality and the full complexity of what's going on is not even being recognized. And that is hugely stressful, and that then causes mental health problems, because they feel that they're not being listened to, and that meanwhile living in chronic pain. So it's we're trying to get to the root of it. We're trying to get to the many roots of the problem, and there are many, and everybody's different. But we have to work through them all, and that's why that first session always takes a long time.
It's so great to get those insights. So if for people that are interested in working with you or your team, how can they best get in touch?
Okay, so our website is nourishinginsights.com. So if they go on the website and they look at the tab that says nutritional therapy, clinic services, they will find a separate tab for UTI, where we've got some FAQs, and that explains a bit more about how we work with that and how we work with Ruth as well. And so, or they can just email us direct, which would be info@nourishinginsights.com. We are a virtual clinic, so we work people all over the world now. Also, we have 2 ladies, there's myself and Naletta, and we also have a guy now who's Olivier. So it's great having him on the team. But also Olivier is French. So that means that if we do have people from France then, or who are French speaking, then he has already worked actually with a couple of people in the French communities who have recurrent UTI. So yeah, they're really, really good. And actually Olivier has done a lot of work on the mental health side as well. And Naletta and I, we tend to work more with the hormonal cases and people thinking about fertility as well. And I've done further training on the fertility side. So it's it's a nice group. It's a really lovely group, and we have team meetings every week. We have team meetings with Ruth as well. So it's been really good to develop this training, to be able to offer this kind of unique support to individuals and get them back on track with their health. It just takes a little bit of time, and as I say, everybody's different, but as long as we take that time, hopefully we will get there in the end.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today, and we'll put a link to your website in the video description.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope people find it useful as a starting point.